The man stood between two freight cars with a steel link in one hand and several tons of moving railroad on either side. He had no radio, no automatic coupler, no protected platform. The engineer was too far away to see his fingers. The cars rolled toward one another, iron wheels clicking beneath wooden bodies, while the gap narrowed around him. His job was to connect them. He guided the link toward an open socket, waited for the drawheads to align, and tried to drop a pin before the cars struck. If the heights did not match, if the link twisted, if his boot slipped, or if the engineer moved too quickly, the space where he stood disappeared. Railroad men called the device a link and pin coupler. It helped build the American West. It also crushed the workers who used it. When people imagine deadly work on the frontier, they usually picture a deputy facing an outlaw, a miner setting dynamite, a buffalo hunter far from help, or a cowboy beneath a stampeding herd. Those jobs could kill. But one of the most dangerous occupations in the entire West belonged to the railroad brakeman, an employee whose ordinary shift required him to climb moving cars, control brakes by hand, switch track, couple equipment, and work close enough to wheels that one missed step could remove a limb. There is no honest way to prove one job was always the single deadliest across every territory and decade. Records were uneven, industries changed, and many deaths were never counted consistently. But by the late 19th century, federal reports made one fact difficult to ignore. American railroads were killing and injuring employees on an industrial scale. Brakemen stood near the center of that toll. The job existed because early freight trains did not possess one automatic braking system controlled entirely from the locomotive. Individual cars had hand brakes. When the engineer needed the train slowed, he signaled with a whistle. Brakemen moved across the train turning brake wheels or applying brake mechanisms car by car. On a freight train, that could mean running along roofs. The cars swayed beneath him. Smoke, steam, cinders, rain, snow, darkness, and wind reduced what he could see. Bridges, tunnels, low structures, and unexpected jolts arrived while his attention was divided between footing and the engineer's signal. The train might be moving through open plains, a mountain grade, or a cut where there was nowhere safe to fall. There were no guardrails along the roof. A narrow running board crossed the top of many cars. The brakeman climbed a ladder, reached the roof, and moved from car to car while the train remained in motion. Gaps opened between equipment. Frost turned wood slick. A sudden application of brakes threw the body forward. A broken board or loose grab iron converted routine into a fall. If he fell outside the rails, he might survive. If he fell between the cars, the train continued. The work became especially severe on western grades. A heavy freight descending from mountain country could not be trusted to the locomotive alone. Brakemen set hand brakes to keep the cars from pushing uncontrollably downhill. Too little braking allowed speed to build. Too much could overheat or damage wheels, cause sliding, break equipment, or create uneven forces through the train. Judgment had to travel down the cars faster than the danger. The engineer communicated through whistle signals. The conductor and brakeman interpreted them. A long blast, short blast, or sequence carried instructions understood through company rules. At night, lantern signals passed orders from ground crews or between men. The train crew worked as a moving chain of human attention. One weak link was enough. The brakeman was often young, physically capable, and not highly paid relative to the danger. Railroads needed large numbers of workers as track expanded through the West. Many men accepted because railroad employment offered regular wages, travel, and the possibility of advancement. A brakeman might hope to become a conductor. Before that promotion, he had to survive the coupling yard, the roof, the switch, the grade, and every piece of defective equipment assigned to his train. The uniform was whatever the work tolerated: sturdy clothes, boots, gloves when they did not interfere, cap, and a lantern after dark. Clothing itself could become a hazard if caught by hardware. Gloves protected the hand but reduced feel. A lantern occupied one hand while the other managed equipment. Every task required compromise. Coupling was the most intimate danger because it placed the worker inside the mechanism. Cars built by different companies did not always line up neatly. Draw heads could vary in height. The brakemen sometimes had to lift or position a heavy link while cars approached. Wooden cars flexed. Slack ran through the train. The couplers came together with an impact that could shatter fingers, even when the worker escaped the larger crush. Experienced men developed methods, timing, and suspicion. They watched wheels, listened to movement, checked the angle of the link, and avoided trusting a signal they had not clearly understood. Yet experience could not remove the basic design. The system demanded that a human enter the gap because the equipment could not connect itself. The railroad later celebrated expansion in miles of track, tons of freight, cities reached, and travel time reduced. Each measure recorded success from the company's point of view. The brakeman measured expansion in opportunities to be killed. More track meant more trains. More trains meant more switching, more couplings, more night work, more mountain descents, and more damaged equipment kept in service. Rapid growth strained yards and crews. The West wanted rails faster than the industry learned to protect the men using them. For decades, danger was treated as part of the occupation. If a brakeman lost fingers, another man could take his place. If he lost a leg, his railroad career usually ended. If he died, the company might investigate, blame carelessness, compensate little, and continue operating the same equipment. The link still had to be dropped. The pin still had to fall. And the next pair of cars was already moving. Railroad danger began before the train left the yard, switching assembled freight cars into an order suited to destinations, cargo, weight, and operating plans. Cars were pushed, pulled, released, redirected, and coupled repeatedly. The yard contained tracks crossing and separating, locomotives moving in both directions, men passing signals, and equipment that could begin rolling with little warning. To an outsider, the movement looked slow. Slow cars killed effectively. A brakeman stepped across rails, climbed ladders, pulled pins, threw switches, rode cars, and signaled engineers who might see only a lantern in darkness. His foot could become trapped in a frog where rails crossed. A car could move on the next track. An expected stop could become a hard impact as slack closed through the train. Slack was the hidden motion inside a freight. Couplers allowed some play between cars. When the locomotive began pulling, the first connection tightened, then the next, sending a series of shocks down the train. When the locomotive slowed, cars behind could run inward. A man standing or climbing felt the train stretch and compress beneath him. A freight that seemed to move at one speed was constantly creating smaller movements between its parts. At night, the yard became a map of lamps and guesses. Coal smoke and steam drifted through lantern light. Iron struck iron. Men shouted names, numbers, and signals. A brakeman might identify a car by chalk marks or paperwork while watching for an engine approaching from behind. Noise made speech unreliable, so hand and lantern signals carried authority. The wrong movement of one light could send a locomotive toward a man who believed the track was protected. The culture valued nerve, but the job required something more difficult: controlled caution in an environment that rewarded speed. Railroads made money by moving cars, not by keeping them still. A crew that switched quickly kept freight flowing. Supervisors measured delay. Customers expected delivery. Workers knew that refusing questionable equipment or slowing a movement could be interpreted as weakness or incompetence. That pressure followed the brakeman onto the road. Once the freight departed, he might ride in the caboose until a signal required action. The caboose offered a stove, benches or bunks, paperwork space, tools, and a lookout from which crew members observed the train. It was not a safe room detached from the machinery. The crew listened for unusual sounds, watched for smoke from overheated bearings, and inspected the line of cars on curves. A hot box could destroy a train. Journal bearings required lubrication. If one overheated, it could smoke, burn, damage the axle, or contribute to derailment. The crew watched for signs and stopped when necessary. A brakeman then approached equipment hot enough to ignite material around it. Mechanical failure did not wait for daylight or a convenient station. Neither did weather. Winter made every exposed surface more dangerous. Snow concealed trackside hazards. Ice covered running boards and brake wheels. Gloves stiffened. Metal burned bare skin with cold. A man climbing the side of a moving car had to choose between numb fingers and reduced grip. On mountain lines, snow sheds and tunnels added overhead danger. Smoke accumulated where air moved poorly, making breathing and visibility worse. Summer brought heat, dust, and sparks. Wooden rolling stock could burn. Locomotives threw cinders. Bridges and trestles could be damaged by fire. A brakeman working above the cars absorbed sun, while the roof vibrated beneath his boots. The job did not contain a safe season. It also exposed men to violence that had nothing to do with gunfighters. A broken drawbar could separate the train. A failed wheel could derail cars. A washed-out track could drop equipment into a ravine. Livestock cars carried animals that shifted weight and panicked. Flat cars carried timber or machinery that could break loose. The brakeman was expected to respond, not observe. If a train separated, rules required protection against following trains. A crew member might walk or run back along the track with flags, lanterns, or explosive warning devices called torpedoes placed on the rail. In open western country, that could mean traveling a long distance alone at night, while the disabled train remained hidden around a curve or grade. The torpedo exploded beneath a locomotive wheel to warn the engineer. It was a small controlled blast intended to prevent a larger one. Railroad rules were written in the language of lessons purchased through accidents. Protect the rear. Repeat the order. Display the signal. Do not assume the track is clear. Inspect the equipment. Each instruction existed because someone had trusted the opposite. Yet the rules operated inside a legal world that often placed responsibility on the worker. The doctrine of assumption of risk held that employees accepted ordinary dangers of their employment. Fellow servant rules could limit company liability when another worker's negligence caused injury. Courts and state laws varied, but injured railroad workers and families faced difficult claims against powerful corporations. The company owned records, supervisors, and legal resources. The dead brakeman owned no explanation. Accident reports often used a few words: fell from train, caught between cars, run over, coupling cars. The language compressed a human body into an operating category. Behind each line was a household receiving reduced wages, or none at all. Railroad communities knew men missing fingers, hands, feet, or legs. A worker returning with an empty sleeve did not need to explain the link and pin coupler. Everyone near the yards understood. If you had been ordered between those cars after watching another man lose his hand, would you refuse and risk the job, or trust your timing because your family needed the wages? Put the honest answer in the comments. The choice was not courage versus cowardice. It was danger now against hunger later. Railroad executives also knew the system was dangerous. By the 1880s, automatic couplers and power braking systems existed. George Westinghouse had demonstrated air brakes in 1869. Eli Janney patented an automatic coupler in 1873. These technologies could reduce the need for men to run across roofs or stand between moving cars. But invention did not equal adoption. Railroads used equipment for years, exchanged cars with other companies, and resisted costly conversion without common standards. One railroad could equip new cars while receiving unequipped cars from another. A safety device became less useful if the train still required old practices for part of its length. The network needed compatibility. Compatibility cost money. So the brakeman continued to supply what the machinery lacked: his hands, balance, attention, and body. The statistics that finally forced national action were difficult to dismiss. The Interstate Commerce Commission began collecting railroad accident information after its creation in 1887. Annual reports counted thousands of employees killed and tens of thousands injured across American railroads. The exact totals varied by reporting year and method, but the pattern remained. Railroad workers died far more often than passengers, and coupling and braking work produced a large share of the injuries. The public bought a ticket and saw a conductor. The casualty tables saw brakemen, reformers, railroad brotherhoods, inventors, and some managers argued that the industry already possessed tools capable of reducing the toll. Automatic couplers could connect when cars came together, allowing workers to uncouple from the side using a lever. Air brakes allowed an engineer to apply braking force through the train rather than relying on brakemen to run along roofs and set individual handbrakes. The word automatic was more than advertising. It meant the worker could remain outside the crushing point. Railroad companies did not all oppose safety, but voluntary adoption moved unevenly. A company investing in safer equipment faced high costs, while competitors continued operating older cars. Freight cars traveled beyond the lines that owned them. Different coupler designs could fail to work together. Managers disputed standards, deadlines, and responsibility. Meanwhile, men kept dying under a problem the industry knew how to reduce. The campaign reached Congress. On March 2, 1893, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Safety Appliance Act. It required common carriers engaged in interstate commerce to equip cars with automatic couplers and continuous brakes under a phased timetable. It also prohibited the use of cars without secure grab irons or handholds. The law did not instantly transform every railroad the next morning. Deadlines, enforcement, extensions, technical disputes, and later amendments followed. Companies had to convert enormous fleets. But the act changed the basic question. Safety was no longer only a private decision between a railroad and its balance sheet. Federal law could require equipment because unsafe cars moved across state lines and killed workers throughout a national system. This shift mattered in the West, where railroads were often the most powerful corporations in a territory or young state. They controlled routes, employment, freight rates, land grants, town growth, and access to markets. Local governments could struggle to regulate a company operating across thousands of miles. The railroad had become national. Safety regulation had to follow it. The automatic coupler attacked the deadliest instant of the brakeman's day. Instead of carrying a link into the narrowing gap, he could prepare the knuckle, allow the cars to meet, and operate a lever from beside the equipment. The system was not perfect. Couplers failed. Cars still moved unexpectedly, and railroad work remained dangerous. But the machine no longer required a man to stand where no space would remain. The air brake changed motion across the entire train. Compressed air traveled through a connected pipe. The engineer could apply brakes on the cars in a coordinated way. Earlier systems and later refinements differed, but the practical revolution was clear. Braking became continuous, rather than dependent on men climbing and turning wheels one car at a time. The brakeman did not disappear. His work changed. He still helped switch cars, inspect equipment, manage signals, protect trains, and assist operations. Hand brakes remained necessary in yards and for securing cars. Coupling hoses and handling hardware still brought risk. But one of the most theatrical and lethal tasks, the run over roofs in bad weather to brake a moving freight, became less central as power brakes spread. This is how the frontier often ended, not with one final gunfight, but with a standard coupler, a continuous brake, a required handhold. The West celebrated individual skill because individual skill was visible. A brakeman balancing on a car roof looked brave. A standardized appliance looked like machinery. Yet machinery saved lives precisely by making heroism unnecessary. The older system had converted preventable danger into a test of manhood. Workers were expected to be quick, tough, and unafraid. Men who hesitated could be mocked. Men who survived believed their habits proved the work could be done safely. Survival can defend a bad system. The experienced brakeman who had coupled thousands of cars without losing a finger knew more about the task than any reformer. He also stood as evidence used against reform. If he could do it, why could not everyone? The answer was probability. A dangerous task performed often enough eventually finds the tired worker, defective car, unclear signal, icy rail, or moment of bad timing. Safety engineering does not need to prove every attempt will fail. It asks why a human must enter the hazard at all. That question was radical in an era when industrial injury was treated as a natural cost of growth. Railroads had already transformed time, distance, settlement, agriculture, mining, and war. They supplied towns and destroyed others by choosing different routes. They carried cattle east and migrants west. Their power made them symbols of progress. The brakeman lived beneath the symbol. He knew the railroad as weight, slack, noise, splinters, smoke, cold iron, and a lantern swinging beside his knee. He knew that a train was not one machine, but dozens of machines striking, pulling, and resisting one another. He felt the moment the locomotive took the slack and heard trouble before passengers noticed. His knowledge was physical. Accident statistics eventually converted that knowledge into public evidence. The nation began counting what railroad communities had seen for years. Once counted, the missing hands and crushed bodies no longer looked like isolated bad luck. They looked like a system, and systems could be redesigned. The old railroad defended itself with scale. Too many cars, too many companies, too much expense, too difficult to coordinate. The reform answered with the same fact. Because the system was so large, individual workers could not fix it themselves. A freight descending a western grade made every weakness in the old system visible at once. Gravity pushed the cars toward the locomotive. Slack compressed. The engine's own brakes could not safely control a long train by themselves, so brakemen climbed from the caboose and locomotive end, moving along the roofs to set hand brakes as the engineer signaled. The first challenge was reaching the wheel. The brakeman climbed a side ladder while the ground moved below him. At the roofline, he shifted his weight over the edge and found the running board. Then he crossed toward the brake wheel, bracing against wind and sway. After setting one brake, he moved to the next car. There might be no bridge plate spanning the gap. He judged the movement, stepped, or jumped across, and continued. The two roofs did not remain level. Loaded and empty cars rode at different heights. Curves shifted the gap sideways. Slack action changed the distance without warning. At night, his lantern distorted depth while occupying a hand he needed for balance. The whistle called for more braking. He continued forward. The amount of force applied to each brake mattered. A wheel turned too loosely contributed little. One tightened too hard could slide a wheel, damage equipment, or create uneven strain. The brakeman used resistance, sound, speed, grade, and experience to judge a machine he could not see as a whole. If the train began running away, the roof became a moving platform above disaster. Speed increased wind and vibration. The locomotive might whistle urgently. Men worked faster precisely when moving became least safe. Curves ahead were designed for controlled trains, not freight gathering speed under thousands of tons of pressure. Some crews regained control. Others reached the bottom as wreckage. Mountain geography made Western Railroad achievements famous. Sherman Hill in Wyoming, crossings through the Sierra Nevada, lines over the Rockies, grades cut through canyons and deserts. Promotional art showed locomotives entering landscapes once considered impassable. The brakeman saw those landscapes from the top of a swaying freight car, often in weather tourists' experience through a window. He also saw the infrastructure below him. Trestles lifted track above ravines. Snow sheds protected routes from slides while trapping smoke. Cuts funneled wind. Tunnels removed the sky. On top of the train, every overhead structure became something to remember. A worker standing upright where clearance narrowed could be struck before he understood his error. Railroads posted warnings and crews learned routes. But an exhausted employee, unfamiliar assignment, unexpected car height, or obscured sign could defeat memory. The workday did not necessarily end after 8 hours. 19th century railroad schedules and labor practices could keep crews on duty for long periods, especially when delays disrupted the plan. A man might wait for a train, work a difficult run, switch cars at a terminal, and be called again after inadequate rest. Fatigue did not look dramatic. It slowed reaction and made ordinary risks more likely. Railroad brotherhoods formed partly because individual workers had little power against those conditions. Organizations representing brakemen and other trainmen pursued wages, benefits, working rules, and greater protection. Mutual aid mattered because injury could erase a family's income immediately. Before broad social insurance, Fellow workers often passed collections for a widow or injured man. The railroad connected the nation while its employees built smaller networks to survive employment. That human network carried practical knowledge. Older brakemen taught younger men where to place a foot, how to read slack when a coupler could not be trusted, and which supervisors pushed crews too hard. The lessons saved lives, but they also normalized the equipment. Men became experts at surviving a design that should have changed. When automatic systems arrived, some workers distrusted them. New machinery could fail, and railroad men had good reason to doubt company promises. Air hoses leaked, couplers failed to lock, mixed trains still contained incompatible cars. Safe operation required inspection and training, not faith in invention. The transition therefore produced a period when old and new dangers coexisted. A train might have power brakes on some cars and hand brakes on others. An automatic coupler could meet obsolete equipment. Workers had to know both systems while companies completed conversion. Federal regulation supplied the deadline that private adoption had lacked. That deadline did not honor the men already killed. It prevented some of their injuries from being repeated. Near the end of a descent, the old-style brakeman returned toward the caboose, releasing or adjusting brakes as ordered. His legs shook from balance and effort. Cinders had burned holes in clothing. His hands hurt from cold metal. The train reached level track, and passengers elsewhere on the railroad described the journey as smooth. They had no reason to know his name. That was the arrangement. The brakeman was most successful when the public never noticed he had been in danger. The brakeman's story changes the way the Old West looks. The classic Western landscape appears open, but the railroad is a corridor of strict control. A train can move only where track has been laid. Its crew works by timetable, signal, written rule, and command. The locomotive looks powerful, yet a broken pin, overheated bearing, washed-out bridge, or misunderstood order can stop it. The brakeman stands where human labor fills every gap between the system's ambition and its actual machinery. He climbs because brakes are not continuous. He steps between cars because couplers are not automatic. He walks back with a warning flag because there is no radio. He watches bearings because instruments do not. He rides the freight because information must travel through a body. This makes him a frontier worker in the deepest sense. The job exists where technology has advanced far enough to create a vast system, but not far enough to make that system safe. There were other deadly occupations. Underground miners faced cave-ins, gas, blasting accidents, bad air, and disease. Logging crews worked around falling timber and moving cables. Cowboys drowned at crossings and died beneath horses or cattle. Law officers and soldiers faced violence. Chinese railroad workers endured blasting, avalanches, exploitation, and discrimination during construction. The brakeman's danger was distinctive because it was repetitive. He did not enter the gap once during a crisis. He coupled cars again and again. He did not climb a roof only when the train malfunctioned. Hand braking was normal operation. The task that could kill him was also the task proving he was doing his job. That is why casualty rates mattered more than a dramatic anecdote. A spectacular accident attracts attention. Repetition hides inside routine. One worker falls. The schedule continues. The mythology of the West often places danger outside civilization, in wilderness, outlaw country, hostile weather, or distant terrain. Railroad work reveals danger built directly into the machinery of civilization. The newest technology in town could be more lethal to its employees than the open range beyond it. Progress had moving parts. They were not guarded. By the end of the 19th century, the Safety Appliance Act and related reforms began changing the physical railroad. Automatic couplers spread. Continuous brakes became standard. Later laws and regulation continued addressing equipment, hours, liability, inspection, and operations. The improvements did not make railroading harmless. Workers continued to be injured and killed, as they still are. Heavy equipment preserves consequences. But the specific demand that a brakeman place his body between approaching cars became increasingly indefensible. The job stopped looking brave. It started looking unnecessary. That change in perception is one of the most important safety advances in American labor history. A society can admire courage so much that it fails to ask why courage is required. Railroad